In a show full of complex, nuanced, and sometimes misunderstood characters, Sons of Anarchy and showrunner Kurt Sutter do a great job of portraying the subtleties of those characters and making them feel three-dimensional. As opposed to some other lesser shows where the characters feel completely one-note and forgettable, Sons isn't afraid to explore the depth of its characters, even if that means that the audience may not like them. Characters' motivations, and more importantly, their actions, will determine how viewers ultimately perceive them. But when you dig a little deeper, you'll find that oftentimes that there is more to these characters than what can be seen at first glance. Hey yo boys, it's been a while. Guess I owe you guys a new video. Y'all ready to get back to work? Alright then, let's mold some clay. Psychology today defines greed as an excessive or insatiable desire. That desire can be for more money, more power, or even more sex/sexual partners. It is tied to materialism, envy, and self-interest. Those words to a T perfectly describe and encapsulate the very being of Clay Morrow, the introductory president of Sons of Anarchy, and simultaneously the stepfather and primary source of angst of the show's protagonist, Jax Teller. Clay formed the club with Jax's late father John, or JT, as one of the first 9 original members and raised Jax as his own after marrying Jax's mother. But despite that familial bond, a lot of the show's tension comes from how Clay and Jax would bump heads with each other when it comes to the future of SOA. Jax's forward thinking versus Clay being stuck in his ways made for an interesting conflict of ideals, but it's who Clay is as a person that always seemed to rub Jax the wrong way. On the outside, Clay seems to be your traditional older ex-con turned biker who lives for the club and the patch, but I think Jax is one of the first people to recognize that there was something much more deep down, something nastier that he didn't like. And in the end, he was right. It wasn't the patch or brotherhood or some idea of a greater purpose that Clay was living for. It was always for himself. Clay is the type of person who, no matter what he had, it would never be enough. Whether it be money, women, or influence, he was never going to be satisfied. And even before Jax was of age, when you look at the things that Clay had done, the signs were all there. He took JT's wife, his business, and eventually his club. JT wasn't even dead yet before Clay started to move in on Gemma, and while there were a lot of domestic factors that played into the fallout between JT and Gemma, Clay didn't exactly stop himself. Going back to the definition of greed, envy definitely played its part in Clay's decision not only to oust his former friend from the club, but in time, his decision to sabotage JT's bike and end his life. John wanted the club to go legit and to stop all the illegal activities they were involved in, but Clay, being who he is, couldn't see the bigger picture. He could only see the potential dollar signs and push for the club to get involved in gun running, which they eventually settled into. This problem extends to his issues with Jax because now as a man, Jax can see that bigger picture that his father saw. That desire for legitimacy has been passed down. Clay, however, views this as a weakness, both financially for the club and emotionally within Jax. But because he raised Jax as his own, he doesn't think it's too late to turn things around for his VP. He and Gemma try to cull whatever remains of JT's latent ideology they think is poisoning who Jax is meant to be. Their attempts to make him into something he's not unintentionally cause a sense of resentment, especially towards Clay. It doesn't help when Jax starts to suspect Clay of undermining his attempts to legitimize the club. Even in one particular instance, when Clay doesn't do anything to sabotage Jax's aspirations for legitimacy, Jax truly believes that Clay was involved because, well, it's well within Clay's character to do something like that. Speaking of Clay's character, so far I've portrayed him as this mustache twirling villain due to him oftentimes being antagonistic towards Jax, but it's much more nuanced than that. While Clay does do some scummy things, the worst of which I haven't even mentioned yet, he never seems to view himself as a bad person, at least not until the end of his tenure on the show. Ron Perlman does such a fantastic job of bringing the complicated nature of Clay out onto the screen. Like a politician, he can be one way on the outside, and at the same time, you can tell he has a hidden agenda more often than not, and he weaponizes diplomacy to navigate some of the more intricate relationships on the show. Most of his motivations seem to be tied to protecting Charming and keeping outside influence from changing the town. But when you look a little deeper, it was more about keeping himself in power. The Sons maintained a tenuous relationship with Charming's police department, specifically with Unser, who mostly looked the other way when it came to the club's less than legal ventures. By keeping that dynamic intact, he could maintain the Sons' hold over Charming. The townspeople only seem to tolerate them because they've managed to keep the violence away. That violence is mostly relegated to the Sons' various beefs with other gangs and MCs that take place outside of Charming. The push-pull relationship Clay has with Marcus of the Mayans is interesting because they low-key hate each other, but still respect each other enough not to allow that hate to turn into another war between their clubs. He may not consider himself a bad person, but he doesn't mind playing the role of the bad guy. For example, when he has Bobby push up against Half-Sack's girlfriend, he doesn't do it for the sole purpose of trying to be an asshole. He does it because he knows that it'll motivate Sack and piss him off enough to be better in a fight that Clay has money on. When he kills McGee for trying to line his own pockets, he justifies it by calling McGee a traitor, even after Clay, ironically, does the same thing the very next season.
You pushed a guy off a roof in Belfast for the exact same thing.
McGee was a rat.
His every action, or even inaction, can be molded into whatever he wants the narrative to be, even when he knows it's not the truth. And if you're not on board with his truth, it makes you a threat. And when threatened, Clay won't hesitate to resort to desperate measures. He kills Piney and tries to have Tara killed for threatening to expose the truth about JT's murder to Jax. The fact that he would rather kill the love of Jax's life rather than face the consequences of his own actions speaks volumes about who Clay really is. The one person who knows that better than anybody is Gemma. She's seen Clay go through all of his highs and lows, from watching him proudly lead the club to having to inject his hands with medication so that he can continue to ride. She's seen it all with Clay, and it's because of how close they are that she's able to see through a lot of Clay's darker deeds, which causes him to lash out at her and then subsequently physically abuse her. She's always been able to compartmentalize his actions as being for the good of the club, but endangering her grandchildren was a definitive step too far for her, causing an irreparable rift that would never be truly healed.
You don't ever put a hand on me again.
Even Tig, Clay's right-hand man and biggest supporter, eventually would go on to see the dark side of Clay's goals and ambitions, leading Tig to abandon his underlying loyalty to his former friend and president. Clay's actions would often have both unintentional and unforeseen consequences, like when he thinks that Opie has flipped on the club, Clay tries to have him killed, but instead, Opie's wife Donna is killed in the attempt. Opie eventually finds out about the scheme, but understands that the real culprit was ATF agent Stahl for making him look like a rat, and Clay's actions were, in his mind, for the good of the club. despite still feeling anger towards Clay. However, when Clay kills Opie's father Piney to save his own skin, this isn't a wrongdoing that Opie is willing to look past, and ultimately results in him attempting to murder Clay.
You're gonna die at the gavel.
I get to say anything here?
My old man get to say anything before you blew a hole in his chest? Sit down!
Going from doing something wrong for the good of the club to selfishly trying to save himself is pretty indicative of Clay's character, and the results speak for themselves. His unsavory attempts at self-preservation alienate him from the people closest to him and leaves him feeling isolated despite still lingering around the club. He manages to survive the gunshot wounds from Opie, but is no longer the strong leader of the club he once was. He's since been supplanted by Jax and is only viewed more as a necessary burden than anything else, only being alive due to his relationship with the Irish, which Jax is desperately trying to get them out of. Clay, being more than aware of his new place in the club's hierarchy, takes advantage of his seemingly weakened state and works with the nomad members of SOA to cause chaos around the town in a desperate attempt to make Jax's leadership look weak in comparison to his own, and to get his spot back at the head of Sam Crow. Jax eventually finds out about this, which only makes his hatred for Clay burn even hotter, which is a shame because despite how it's gotten between the two, it wasn't always an antagonistic relationship. When Abel gets kidnapped and Jax is dealing with major depression as a result, Clay is the primary voice in Jax's life, telling him to pull it together for the sake of his son.
Either Abel is dead and you want revenge, or he's alive and you would kill to find him. And if you can't make that decision, then you better get down on your hands and knees and pray for something to get you there.
Clay unsuccessfully tries to call off his hit on Tara after finding out that Jax and his kids would be with her the day it was supposed to go down, not wanting them to get caught in the crossfire. And while obviously a hit on Tara would deeply hurt Jax, Clay, at a bare minimum, does seem to care about Jax's physical safety. Things like that show that Clay really does care for Jax, but allowed his own ego and nature to get in the way of that relationship, leading them to where they are now. Jax executes his own plot not only to oust Clay from the club permanently, but to throw him in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Before this happens, we get a rare moment to see Clay's emotional vulnerabilities, with him crying at the realization that one of the most important things in his life, Sons of Anarchy, has been taken away from him completely. Not only that, but Gemma refuses to be his alibi for the murder he was framed for, losing her and the club back to back in the scheme orchestrated by Jax, using Juice and Gemma as pawns. It shows that Jax actually learned from Clay, because this is exactly the kind of play Clay would make. A sort of student becoming the master moment for the both of them.
This isn't about me and my mistakes. It's about you. And the one that you're about to make.
I'm tired of being crushed under the weight of greedy men who believe in nothing. I have to change that.
At first, Clay was just metaphorically isolated from the club, but now with him being in jail alone, he's literally isolated from the rest of them, leaving him with nothing but time to lament on the things that he's done that has led him to this point. It's one of the few times in the show that Clay ever shows any authentic remorse that isn't just a small part of a larger play. He gets to act on this remorse in a tangible way by refusing to cooperate with a retired U.S. Marshal in an investigation against the club, putting himself in mortal danger by doing so. He's only spared the consequences because Galen and the Irish have decided to spring Clay from prison, needing him alive. When the prison transport is disrupted, he assumes it's the IRA, but is surprised to see Jax and the club actually being the ones to break him out. He's not dumb, so he clearly knows something is going on, but is still caught a bit off guard when they kill Galen and slowly realizes that they're going to kill him too, although he comes to terms with it relatively quickly.
I guess you had another vote I wasn't privy to.
Yeah, we did. This time it was unanimous.
Fair enough.
He understands why this has to happen, but there's still just the smallest hint of regret in his eyes. Not just because of the things that he's done, but because he never really got a chance to make up for them. Especially what he did to Gemma and how he fractured their relationship. She's the last thing he sees before Jax finally pulls the trigger and ends his life. The thing about Clay's place in the story is that he represents what happens when you hold on too tight to the past and burn down any potential future that you might have had. His innate fallout with Jax is due to Jax's desire to legitimize the entire organization, but Clay, being who he is, eyes wide shut, he couldn't see the end game. He couldn't see the bigger picture that Jax had in mind. And when you think about it, I don't even know if I would necessarily even say that, because I think it's that he could see the bigger picture, but he was so impatient. He didn't have time to wait. Jax knew it would take time to set things up. He knew it would take time to set things up, but he's old and he didn't have time to wait. And Clay, being a selfish person, a selfish character, he's not concerned about setting the club up for a better future. He's always looking out for himself. So he wants to get his, but he wants to get his now. And that is part of the reason he was always butting heads with Jax, because Jax had time to set this up and to wait. Clay didn't. Clay, being older and not having time to wait for Jax's plans to fall through, sees the writing on the wall and realizes that he won't be able to cash out while he still can, which is why he makes the deal with the cartel to transport coke, despite Jax's reservations and the club's long-standing aversion to running drugs. That relationship with that same cartel eventually curtails into Tara's assassination attempt, in conjunction with Piney's murder and Gemma's beating, sets him on a collision course with Jax, to the point where, so to speak, the town wasn't big enough for the both of them.
You beat the shit out of my mother.
You better stop focusing on my domestic life and start focusing on the issue at hand.
Oh, I'm focused. And this ain't finished.
His relationship, or lack thereof, with Jax is narratively the most important to the story, but personally, his most important relationship is with Gemma. As where the club would grow weary and tiresome of Clay's actions, Gemma would always try to understand and even justify them in her own way. That all changed when his proclivities affected her on a more personal level. Despite her disdain for him, one of the last things he does while in prison is turn over all his assets to her, and even tries to protect her from these creepy cuck prison guards. It's because of things like that and their decades-long relationship, she still mourns him after he dies, despite her feelings toward the man he became.
Clay Morrow should have been dead a long time ago.
I hated him so much.
Even though Clay is at first jealous of Nero and tries to demolish his relationship with Gemma, he does in time come to the realization that Gemma is legitimately happy with Nero and gives his blessing, if you can call it that, for her to move on. Because of the circumstances of his character, Ron Perlman spent most of the final season separated from the rest of the principal cast, but the writing on the show is so good, it never feels like he's too far away from the main plot. And the sense of isolation is all the more believable because it's actually how Perlman felt at the time.
I was in complete isolation, so I never worked with any of the regulars, and it was kind of like this storyline kind of was mirrored in real time in the show, and by the end of it, I was like, I was you know, it was a very strange departure.
Yeah, because you kind of hung out with everybody because you all shot all these scenes together, and then your character is isolated, so you're not really hanging out with the cast members as much as.
I saw everybody on that very last episode. They all, nice to see you.
Wow.
Right
That's
this way,
deep.
sir, for your 6 bullets.
From what I can tell, Perlman was never necessarily bitter about it because he understood that narratively it made sense to kill Clay off when they did, rather than waiting for the endgame of the final season. His death in the show definitely felt a little different than some of the other prominent character deaths portrayed because it didn't come out of left field. It felt like something that had been building since season 1, finally reaching a crescendo. It felt earned. He escaped mayhem before thanks to a vote that wasn't unanimous, but there was no snaking out this time.
You don't have to feel guilty.
I don't feel guilty. You earned it.
Yeah. I did.
The tragic part of Clay's character is that his actions were framed as being a means to an end, with him wanting to make enough money to retire comfortably, but the reality is, due to his own greed, no amount of money would have ever been enough. He never would have stopped killing anyone who got in his way. He never would have stopped breaking the bylaws of Sam Crow. He never would have stopped going down the path he did unless someone with an equally or stronger will got in his way, which is essentially what happened. I think he ultimately serves as a cautionary tale for what can happen when the old guard of a group or organization doesn't make room for the new blood and get so stuck in their ways that they'd rather tear down the foundations of what previously made it great and restructure it into an unrecognizable mess that betrays the core tenets of what they believe. Jax comes dangerously close to becoming another Clay, but it's thanks to the warnings and listening to the guidance of the people around him, particularly the older members of the club, that Jax is able to narrowly avoid that fate and become a much more effective leader. Clay never listened, so he never learned. Clay is a fantastic character in his own right, and he serves the all-important task of being an antagonistic foil to Jax and even to Gemma in the later parts of the series, but I don't think the narrative would have been as dynamic as it ultimately ended up being if not for his presence as a character and the brilliant and electric performance from Ron Perlman as Clay Morrow. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys have been amazing holding this channel down with likes, subscriptions, comments, all that shit. Most of it coming from the Sons of Anarchy videos, so I really felt like I owed y'all one. And side note, I'm actually unemployed now, so I'm gonna have a lot more time to work on these. So if you want to help your boy out, keep liking, keep subscribing, and all that shit. Cause right now this is my only form of income. So yeah, help a nigga out for real. Yeah, anyway, I'll keep putting them out. Y'all keep watching them. And yeah, that's it. I'm Josh Fleeks. Till next time, y'all be easy.